Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. So, I recently had the opportunity to sit down and chat with Morgan Day, lead encounter designer at Blizzard Entertainment, and talk a little bit about raids, dungeons, and game design in general. Now, we were audio only for the interview, so if you want, you can of course tab out and just listen to this in the background. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed the interview. Let me know what you think, and yeah, I give you Morgan Day. Yeah, so just to kick us off, I suppose, if you tell us a bit about your role in the team and essentially what you're actually working on with World of Warcraft.
Yeah, so my role on the team, my title is lead encounter designer. So I work on all things relating to dungeons, raids, creature abilities, spells, things like that. And yeah, I've been just working on raids recently, working on Tomb of Sargeras and the things beyond that.
Ah, yes, well, soon we'll have to get into those at a later date. So if you were to pick one encounter in World of Warcraft that's like your favorite, what would that be?
In all of World of Warcraft?
Yeah, we'll go big.
Oh man, that's a really hard question to answer. It's like asking someone to choose their favorite child. I've been involved in so many of them. I can talk a little bit about like the upcoming raid, like Tomb of Sargeras. One of the things I'm super excited about in Tomb is we have a lot of encounters that actually involve the environment and bringing parts of the environment into play into the encounter. One of the things I've always wanted to do in WoW, and we never really had the opportunity to, or the place where it made sense, is something I always call it "Don't break the ice." It's like where the floor kind of falls out in pieces around you. We've done some things like that, like Lich King had pieces of the edge that would fall off. Black Hand, you had floors that you fell through, but never like, okay, the whole floor is like 50 pieces and they can all fall apart individually. So I'm super stoked about, finally doing that in Tomb of Sargeras. Fallen Avatar does that if you're not familiar with that.
Yeah, I watched the Fat Boss video on it. It looks pretty damn cool. So I suppose I was going to ask if there's any overriding design pillar or goal that the teams had when developing Tomb. Would that be more of the environmental design for you, or are there other things at play there?
There's a couple things there, really. I mean, with any raid, really, we really look at what's the story we're trying to tell, what's the fantasy we want to get across. With Tomb of Sargeras, it was all about the culmination of what we've been going through with Legion. And, we're gathering the pillars of creation from all the different zones. And now we're finally getting a chance to take all these pillars, now that we've gotten them all, into the Tomb of Sargeras and seal it back up, So, like, at the end of each wing, there's a little pedestal that you can socket in each of the pillars. And then once you do that, you get access to the Titan vaults and, the Fallen Avatar and Kil'jaeden.
This is probably getting into something I think the community will be interested in. The Tomb of Sargeras is the first raid, I assume, that was created while Legion was a live game, actually out in the wild. And with Legion having a lot of new systems like the artifacts and the legendaries, concordance of Legion Fall, all the different sort of power mechanics, how has that impacted how you've designed Tomb of Sargeras?
Probably not the answer you're looking for. It hasn't really impacted how we design the raid. We've been making raids for a long time. We have a formula that we feel works, and we have been able to work with and stick to. The thing that actually changed the most from my perspective was we tuned the Nighthold no less than 3 times, like completely tuned it from the ground up. Like, okay, guys, let's get into the spreadsheets. Let's look at the numbers. Let's figure this out. And we realized, oh, okay, crap, there's a lot of things we didn't consider, like all the, how artifacts are affecting players and the new legendaries. So with Tomb, we were like, you know what? Let's just do that once. Let's save ourselves a lot of headache and a lot of time and just do this once. So that's why, like Kil'jaeden is actually going to be up on the PTR for the first time today. And one of the reasons is we were like, okay, cool. We have all the class changes in, we have the new legendaries, let's tune it up and then throw it on the PTR.
What do you feel has worked out really well with the raid content of Legion, and is there anything that you feel maybe worked out less well or could be done slightly differently in the future?
Let's see. I think in terms of what I've been happy with, I'm really happy with the overall pacing with the Legion raids. Like we've talked about, one of the goals of Legion was releasing content at a engaging experiences at a satisfying pace. And in the past, like with Foundry, for instance, we always talked about, like, did we come out with that a little bit too early? Like, could we have given Heimel a little bit more time to breathe, et cetera? And I think we had the pacing really figured out this time, or at least we're a lot happier with it. You know, like we had Trial of Valor come in between Emerald Nightmare and Nighthold. Sorry, just drawing a blank there.
Actually, now that you mentioned the Trial of Valor, it was, and remembering back from like when I sort of first started raiding in Wrath, when there was a few of the smaller raids, or even stuff like Bastion of Twilight, how do you feel it worked having a smaller raid instance like that just sort of slot in between the two sort of larger, more established ones?
I think it worked out pretty well. I was actually really happy with Trial of Valor for a couple reasons. One, you know, it did a great job of tying up that story that you saw with Odin and Helya and Stormheim, and that, you know, kind of like B plot that was playing out there. We really got to wrap that up. I also was really pleased with just the Helya encounter. You know, it was the first time that I can recall within recent history, at least, where we had a dungeon boss that we then translated into a raid boss. And there were a lot of cool similarities there. So people who had done the dungeon boss went into the raid fight and be like, oh yeah, this thing, I remember this thing.
Yeah, nice. I think it definitely, from a player perspective, it's nice having a bit of a break in pace with a kind of a smaller, more, well, easy to get into from a time perspective, sort of thing slotted in there.
Yeah, it also worked out really well with, like, you know, the Halls of Valor, that, you know, Odin's room is just like, when you walk in there in the dungeon, it's just like such a spectacle. You're like, this is a crazy awesome room. Like, almost when we saw it the first time, we were like, this is a raid room. Like, this is the coolest. This is as cool as we would see in a lot of our raid encounters. I
guess when you mention Helya, this comes into a few different questions that I've sort of sourced around. So I think for the first one, what do you think about encounter durations? And this is especially if it's an encounter where a lot of that difficulty is really compounded into the final phase of the fight.
Yeah. So not too much has changed over the years with of WoW with encounter durations. You know, like if we have something, I always call them like a patchwork fight internally. You know, with Patchwork and Naxxramas being the first one, where it's like, okay, there's very few mechanics. We just have to execute these for a short time, and then we're gonna win, right? You don't want that fight to last more than a couple of minutes. But with an encounter, for instance, like Helya, like we're talking about, she's got a couple of phases. There's like what we call intermissions. There's a lot of things in there that you need time to breathe. So that's why those take a bit longer. You know, anything when it pushes, like, you know, some of our older encounters were over like 15 minutes, which is a long time to be fighting a dungeon or a raid boss. So we try to, you know, keep the duration lower than that where possible, but also you don't want things to feel like they're happening on top of each other. With things that are the most difficult in the last phase, that's an interesting one. I'm actually kind of curious what your thoughts on that too. I've heard lots of different, you know, philosophies and arguments there. Like for me, when I look at it and think like, well, let's just call it a 6-minute encounter for, you know, time's sake. If the hardest part's 2 minutes in, what's the point of the last 4 minutes, right? Like, there's a balance there. Yes, having the hardest part of the fight happen 14 minutes into the fight can be, you know, brutal. Like that's just super grueling on a raid group. But you know, often those long encounters are the end boss, and they have lots of stuff going on. So you have to kind of balance that.
And on the topic of sometimes where there's individual responsibility, which is something that seems to have came a lot more into raid encounters over the last few years, and I think to great effect in most times, but I've heard a lot of feedback from some of the Mythic raiding community that they've just had times where, you know, there's a mechanic, someone makes a bit of an oopsie, and pretty much splat for the raid. I wonder what your thoughts have been on that, I suppose.
A lot of that really depends on the audience, right? Like, if you're a normal mode group, and we're talking about a normal mode raid, if an individual makes a mistake, usually we'll say, okay, that guy gets to die, right? Like, you messed up, you go sit in the corner for a minute, you're on timeout. In a Mythic raid, especially if it's towards the end, if an individual messes up, we're more willing to say, okay, cool, wipe it up. You know, like Grand Conjunction is a good example. Like, I think it puts a debuff on you that makes you take like 200% bonus damage. In reality, that probably just could have one-shot the whole raid, right? Like that, but that's also a mechanic that we only introduced in Mythic, and that was also a boss that we knew was going to be, you know, one of the harder ones in the zone. So really, it just depends on the audience and where it is in the raid.
Yeah, cool. I suppose when we're actually on the topic of difficulty and things like that, another thing that I find personally to be a really fascinating topic is how add-ons play a bit of a role when it comes to things. Certainly from a player perspective, we're all using DBM and bigwigs. There's been times then, like with AVR back in Wrath, where it was getting a little bit funky with Putricide, if I recall correctly.
Yep, that was one.
More recently, like friendly nameplate restrictions, the range meter. So I guess the question is, as a designer, what is it like designing encounters knowing that players are going to have this pretty wide array or a wide suite of tools?
This is an interesting question. So we don't really design around mods or with mods in mind. Like, all right, well, this is a mechanic that I'm going to make, and I know they're going to make this mod. Like, that's not something we really do. We have an internal raid team that tests all of our encounters. Also, the encounter designers, we have a pretty good sized team, so we do our own testing with each other. We really just look for things that we can use in game to sell those types of mechanics. Like, so for instance, the things that we've used in the past that work pretty well, and we always try, to mark a thing that's like, okay, this is a big deal. Let's use the boss's energy bar. And when his energy bar gets to full, he's going to use this mechanic, right? So that's a thing that we've started to do, since, I think Warlords is when we really started doing that more and more. Long cast times is what we'll use often. Like I was talking about Grand Conjunction earlier. I think that has like a 4 or 5 second cast time, which for a Mythic mechanic, that's like an eternity. You used to like really quick reaction times on things like that. But we put a long cast time in there. The duration of that debuff is pretty long as well. So you have a lot of time a lot of wiggle room there to deal with it. So there are, things that we try to do to accommodate those more difficult mechanics. We don't design around them or design with them in mind, though.
All right, this is an interesting one. It comes from a few chats that I ended up having with Asmongold, where basically we were talking about the amount of things that were going on in fights and the sort of signal to noise ratio that sometimes that there ends up being. And what's the team's thoughts on managing in sort of encounters like that and the complexity creep that naturally ends up happening?
Right. That's a really good question. Need a second to ponder on that one. That's a great question. So I think there's probably a few parts to this answer. The first one I think kind of harkens back a little bit to what we were just talking about with the audience, right? I think the audience has been evolving and changing over time. Like for instance, this is not even the audience changing, but the system changing. We didn't used to have 3 raid difficulties, right? Like if you think back to Wrath of the Lich King, we had normal and heroic. There were just the 2. Now we have added mythic. So we've got more layers of difficulty, and on top of that, the target audience has been evolving, and those guilds have been together a long time and getting better. So I think a lot of that has to do with just the target audience and designing for that audience. Additionally, we've been doing a lot more, and even more in Tomb of Sargeras, you'll see with like LFR, like we mentioned with the target audience. Not only do we change how we might deal with a specific mechanic where it won't one-shot you in normal, or it doesn't kill the raid on normal, we also try to wholesale remove mechanics from some of the lower difficulties. So like let's Gul'dan, for instance, right? On normal difficulty in phase 2, he doesn't even summon Dreadlords, right? Like that whole mechanic, that whole ability, an entire add is just gone. So we try to like layer things in there as the audience kind of changes. The second part of this, I know you said noise in the sense of like trying to keep all the things in my brain, but I think that goes to a larger point, which is something that we could be doing better, I think, and something I personally want to try to improve, which is just the visual clarity in the game. Like there's, raid damage that's happening. Does that really need to have this gigantic effect on my screen? I don't know, does it? Also, like one that we always giggle about is there's a little swirly on the ground. Okay, do you want me to stand in it? Do you want me to not stand in it? Do you want me to run? Is it going to do less damage the further away I am? I don't know. There's a swirly though, and we've used that to mean multiple things. So I think attacking it from that perspective also will help a lot. Like increasing the visual clarity of the game. Of okay, this is when I see this visual, I know it means it's meteor damage. When I see this other visual, I know it means it's fall off damage, etc.
Nice. Yeah, I think that would actually be a pretty awesome push to have. I'm even looking at some of the stuff from Tomb. I think it was Goroth who has all of the pillars. And I really loved how a lot of the fights seem to feel quite, once you learn the basics, very intuitive. As far as it, there's just a sort of a physicality to how you're just positioning these pillars, and it's not a UI element.
Yeah, I think, shoot, I forget the encounter off the top of my head, but actually Il'gynoth is a good example. If you did Mythic Il'gynoth, his Mythic mechanic, he had those roots, and there was that big beam. The Dragons of Nightmare had the same effect, right? Where there was this big red beam, and if you stand in it, the red beam goes away. I think that's a good example of something where that is something we're experimenting with, and using that visual language to sell that mechanic is something we'll try to do more in the future, and identify things like that where we can improve and come up with something consistent.
I suppose we've been talking a lot about like effects and things like that, so may as well just do the one question that's a little bit more the whole hog into that. From a technical perspective then, what's it like developing encounters with the World of Warcraft engine? So like how often are you guys like throwing a feature request over to the engineering guys, and just sort of what's it been like working the game as the engine has evolved in terms of its capabilities?
Yeah, it's really, really amazing. We have this huge library, this huge suite of things that we can pull from over the course of the last 10 years or whatever. And we also have an internal tools team that we can ask for features whenever we feel that it's necessary, or if there's a thing that we want to do that's just really cumbersome to actually put into the game. We have a fantastic engineering team that is super passionate about the game. Some of our lead programmers are often in our office talking to us about a mechanic or a boss fight that they were doing last night, etc. So everyone's really into the game and is really invested in just making it as good as they can. So if we say like, hey, we have this crazy idea that we want to do, chances are, given how robust our tools are, we can do it, right? Where there's a will, there's a way. We can figure out how to make it work, but there's probably a way to make it work better if we got support from some of the other teams. So they're really, really cool about helping us with that kind of thing.
Cool. Yeah, I'll need to find a stray USB stick with WoW added on it someday.
Exactly. If you come by, we'll show it to you.
Cool. So I guess let's just hop over a little bit over towards just some general stuff and dungeons. So one thing that's been on my mind a lot is that encounter design is normally associated with the raids and the dungeons. Do you think that more aspects of some of the combat design that we see in raids and dungeons could be applied to the open world? And I guess what's mainly in my head here is an example like, say, the Timeless Isle elite mobs, which had a little bit more, like their damage was shifted away from their auto attack damage and kind of towards their ability sets.
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. So, fun story. Every single creature basically in the game that you see in the outdoor world, an encounter designer has touched it, and they've looked at it. They've even implemented it in most cases. So, for instance, that Timeless Isle example you gave, the person who made all of those abilities was also an encounter designer. Like you mentioned, more avoidable type mechanics, we usually try to introduce those things when we expect, a high degree of difficulty or in like a solo challenge. So for the Timeless Isle, for instance, we knew those were going to be difficult creatures that we wanted you to have to learn the mechanic to be able to defeat it. But that was also like patch content. It was also late in the expansion. I don't know that we would want to do something like that with a whole zone of monsters, right? You also have to consider, like, when I'm leveling up, I'm going to pull 4 or 5 monsters. What's it look like when I have 4 or 5 of those guys doing that avoidable attack? And then the poor guy who's just trying to quest in the POI just happens to run behind me and get splatted, right? Like, you don't have that expectation as you're questing through Azuna or Stormheim, where when you go and opt into a zone like Timeless Isle, you kind of know what you're getting yourself into.
Right, yeah. So I guess another one, because you mentioned the artifact challenges, and now I suppose 2 months have passed since that. How does the team feel about those, and in general just the topic of that kind of like challenging solo content?
I thought that was a really cool opportunity for us to explore that, like you're saying, that different type of solo challenging content. I think they turned out really cool. I've been doing them myself on live. Had a lot of fun with them. People have really kind of banded together and come up with different strategies and different tactics. And, one of the things that I thought was a good example of those solo challenges was it wasn't just about like a raw DPS or, raw healing throughput. There were actually things and puzzles to solve that involved using more of your class abilities and more of your buttons. And I think that's something that's super duper interesting, even from an encounter designs perspective in dungeons and raids. So often our raid encounters turn into how much DPS can we do, and if we throw more DPS at it, is that going to solve the problem for us? Where I think we could do more with things like CC and kiting and snaring, even in a raid environment. You look back at things like, I always loved to point out Gluth. Way back in Naxxramas, you had your little squads, your little like kiting team squads, and I thought that was super interesting. So seeing more stuff like that, I'm super excited about.
So Yeah, let's hop over to some of the dungeon content then.
Mhm.
I think the first one is that Mythic Plus, I think, has been brilliant, like really awesome for the expansion,
Cool.
and I think it solidifies dungeons as being kind of a larger part of World of Warcraft's endgame as a whole. So, with that in mind, as kind of the role of a dungeon, do you think we'll see any changes, perhaps, to the boss design, or really just any of that in dungeons? Now that for many people, perhaps even replacing some elements of raid content.
Right. Yeah. I too love Mythic Plus. I have done a tremendous amount of them. I think they're really, really fun. They're really enjoyable. Um, in terms of how Mythic Plus affects how we design the dungeons, was that the question?
I think a little bit of that, and also if dungeons themselves are going to be like a larger part of the game overall, are there any, just like going forward, sort of any maybe different decisions that would be made? Perhaps bosses having additional mechanics, just things in along those lines.
Yeah, for sure. With Mythic Plus in mind, I think a lot of the things with like trash mechanics, for instance, we've been trying to keep in mind. Like, okay, cool. What does this trash pack look like if it's volcanic weak? Or what does this trash pack look like if it's sanguine weak? Is the floor just going to be completely covered? So we try to keep things like that in mind. Another thing we've been running into is, tyrannical is, really cool in that it makes you really start to learn the mechanics of a dungeon boss. But one of the things we've also seen and have been trying to keep in mind is like, encounters that have a mechanic that just stacks up forever in a dungeon, where you usually would kill it while it just kind of still tickles. With tyrannical, if you're talking like a high Mythic Plus with tyrannical, that mechanic suddenly might make that boss like way harder like than some of the other bosses in the zone. So we've been trying to keep an eye on those. We've even, I think, sent some targeted nerfs out at, Wrath of Ajara was one that we nerfed because it's just like, okay, this is constant pulsing raid damage. Just got feedback today, in fact, with like someone on my team was talking to me, like, hey, so Grievous is this week. I was doing Arcway, and the gauntlet at the end of Arcway really hard with Grievous, and I was like, yep, sure is. I did it too, and yep, you're not wrong. We'll have to look at that one. That's a good point,
Cool. So on the topic of dungeons as well, one that I really have loved so far is Court of Stars, because it's had a few more, I suppose, interactive mechanics, things that have involved our classes, professions, things like that.
Yeah.
How do you guys feel like the Court of Stars worked out, and could we maybe be seeing more of those sort of interactive elements in the future?
Yeah, I absolutely love that dungeon. I think it's a really, really great dungeon, and is a good example of, like you said, that was a kind of hand of the designer way of getting some of those core class mechanics in, right? Like, we had to say, hey, here's the buff that you get if you're a hunter, right? I like when we can do that more organically, like we were talking about earlier, like, hey, hunters are really good to have in here because they can do X, Y, and Z, or, oh, we have a rogue, so we can stealth past these trash mobs, or things like that. I think work really well. Court of Stars also, I do enjoy as well. I thought worked really well. We went into that one knowing that, okay, let's make a kind of like more non-standard WoW dungeon. We've got a cool opportunity here with like, we're kind of sneaking in, we're going in the middle of a party, we're trying to like sneak our way through here and get to the Grand Magistrix at the end. The ending, we were all wondering, speaking of add-ons, we were all wondering how that ending was going to work out. Like, is anyone going to figure out how to make an add-on where they like pick out the thing for us? Hopefully not. We'll see. But we also tried to build in things there where the classes were helping, so like whenever I have a prop paladin tank in that instance, I get stoked because I'm like, yes, I have a prop paladin. We're going to get through, I call it Guess Who. We're going to get through Guess Who really quickly because we have a prop paladin this time. So whenever we can find ways to make those work, I think it's awesome.
Oh yeah, how are we for time?
Yeah, we probably have time for one more question.
Cool. Yeah. So I'm going to slightly cheat, and it's a slight two-parter. But yeah. So what is the like as an encounter designer? What's the process of really designing a boss? So, like, do you guys start off with a list of mechanics? Is there like a master Excel spreadsheet of all the boss mechanics you can do? Maybe
right.
art, geometry, things like that. Then as the part two, from the internal perspective, what's it like doing that initial raid testing? And like, how many iterations are you going through and all that stuff before we really see it in live?
Oh, that's interesting. So with boss design, the way we kind of handle that is we have, these super high level kickoff meetings with, all the game directors and stuff like that. Where we're like, okay, cool. What's the first raid? Who are we going in there to kill? What's my motivation? What's going to be in there? From there, we kind of figure out like, okay, cool. what's the boss list, right? So for Emerald Nightmare, it was like, all right, what if we did the green dragons again, and what if Xavius, who we're going to see in the outdoor world, is the end boss of this one because he's kind of the master of the nightmare, right? From there, we sit down with all the encounter designers. So we get in a big room and we have a big brainstorm where we just try to talk about like high level things, like, we went with Xavius, for instance. One of the ideas that we were talking about was like, okay, cool. What if half the raid goes into the dream and the other half is outside the dream, and there's this like corruption mechanic so that the people who are dreaming can soak the corruption from the people who aren't dreaming. And then that was like the one big high level hook that we had. And then from there, you just kind of give it to an encounter designer who makes it their own and takes it to completion. Raid testing, like I mentioned, we have an internal team, so we do a lot of testing internally as well as within our own encounter team. So yeah, we'll usually go through at least 1 or 2 iterations before it goes off to the PTR or off the beta or wherever it may be. So we do a lot of looking at our own stuff internally.
Yeah, awesome, cool. Well, I think that's that's pretty much us then. Brilliant. Yeah, thank you. That was a pleasure.
No, thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate your time.
So there you have it. I think an interesting discussion indeed. For me, the key takeaways were that I really do enjoy these more environmental mechanics, so it's definitely good to see that stuff happen in the Tomb of Sargeras. And certainly, in my guild, people not really knowing what the Swirlies did, that was kind of legendary, so I'm definitely interested to see Blizzard's efforts and, how they can perhaps improve some of the readability of some elements of the fights like that. But yeah, of course, the Tomb of Sargeras comes out on the 20th of June, and likely we're looking at the 13th of June for the release of patch 7.2.5. There'll be more content on the channel within the next few days, so be sure to check back. But that's it for me, guys. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.